Imagine your tiny garage startup
Right.
just pulled off this massive miracle. Like you spent the weekend taking down 5 global tech monopolies.
Right, just completely dismantling them.
Yeah. The whole industry is in shock. And the biggest, wealthiest CEO in the game comes to you and offers this, just $1 billion buyout. All you have to do is hand over your tech.
It's the ultimate payday.
Exactly. The ultimate payday. And you look at this unimaginable wealth and you walk away with absolutely nothing just to keep your mission pure.
Which, I mean, sounds completely insane today.
Totally insane. But thousands of years ago, according to the ancient texts we are exploring today, a nomadic leader did exactly that. Welcome to today's deep dive. And, you know, if you are tuning in, I know you. You're a learner. You are the kind of person who seeks out that deep perspective-shifting knowledge, the kind that basically rewires how you understand human behavior.
And today's source material provides a brilliant lens for exactly that kind of rewiring. We are examining a really fascinating lecture that deconstructs the ancient narratives of the Book of Genesis, specifically focusing on Abraham and Jacob.
Yeah, but we are completely skipping the standard sanitized Sunday school summaries, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The lecture approaches these texts not as, like, dusty museum artifacts, but as radical case studies in human psychology. It's all about power dynamics and the subversion of our natural instincts.
And I think it's important to say that whether you are religious, strictly secular, or, anywhere in between, these are foundational narratives of Western culture. The lecture we're analyzing argues that the original, highly disruptive meaning of these stories has just been totally lost to modern audiences.
It really has. The source uses these ancient accounts to examine how we interact with leverage, what happens when we hit absolute rock bottom, and what the true lost meaning of faith actually entails.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the first scenario the source highlights completely upends how we think about accumulating power. It begins with Abraham and his nephew, Lot.
Right. So these two are leading these massive nomadic encampments, and they run into a very practical economic problem. Their herds have just grown way too large for the local resources.
Which means their shepherds are essentially going to war over grazing land and water rights.
Exactly. And in the hierarchical structure of the ancient Near East, the senior patriarch dictates the terms. Abraham holds all the leverage here. He has the total right to claim the best land and basically banish his nephew to the margins.
But he doesn't do that.
No, he doesn't. Instead, he makes this massive voluntary concession of power. He gives Lot the very first choice of the entire landscape.
And Lot, he surveys the region and naturally chooses the prime real estate, like the fertile, well-watered plains to the east, down near the city of Sodom. And Abraham is just left with the rugged, less desirable leftovers.
He voluntarily diminishes his own economic standing, which perfectly sets the stage for a really wild geopolitical crisis.
Yeah, because a regional war breaks out.
Mm-hmm.
It's a coalition of 5 allied kings against 4 other kings, and Lot just gets swept up in this massive ancient conflict. He's taken captive, along with all his wealth.
Which forces Abraham to pivot from, a peaceful nomad into a military commander. And the lecture points out the sheer absurdity of the logistics here. Abraham musters his own household guard, which consists of just 318 men.
Wait, really? Just 318 guys?
That's it. He takes this tiny localized force and launches a nighttime surprise attack against an entire victorious superpower coalition.
And he wins. He completely routs the allied kings, rescues his nephew Lot, and recovers this massive fortune and stolen loot and captives.
Right.
Which brings us back to that garage startup analogy. I mean, taking 318 guys to fight a coalition of kings is tactical suicide. It just shouldn't work.
But it does.
Yeah, it miraculously does. And then the king of Sodom, who had previously been defeated by this same coalition, he meets Abraham. The king tells Abraham to return the people, but insists Abraham keep all the recovered wealth.
And by the established rules of ancient warfare, this is entirely legitimate. Abraham won it. It's his.
But Abraham refuses. He tells the king, I will not take so much as a thread or a sandal thong from you. He leaves all that unimaginable wealth right on the table.
What's fascinating here is, the underlying mechanism behind that refusal. The source argues this specific moment defines what faith originally meant in antiquity. It wasn't about mental assent to a doctrine. It was the radical physical act of letting go.
Letting go of the leverage?
Yes. Abraham understood that accepting that wealth would fundamentally shift his reliance. He explicitly tells the king of Sodom that he is refusing the loot so the king can never claim, I made Abraham rich.
Right. He is guarding his independence independence. Because if he takes the money, he becomes a vassal, politically and psychologically indebted to a corrupt earthly power.
Exactly. He went to war strictly to liberate captives, not to extract a payday. The source emphasizes that Abraham recognized his strength derived entirely from an absolute reliance on a higher power, not from worldly leverage.
To accept that immense wealth would have compromised the integrity of his mission.
It's a total rejection of the conventional power dynamics of human history, where victory is always leveraged for maximum material gain.
He fights the biggest battle of his life and just chooses to walk away empty-handed. And that leads directly into how the source analyzes Abraham's relationship with the divine, which honestly operates on a logic completely foreign to our modern assumptions.
It really does.
Yeah.
The narrative moves to a moment where God decides to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah due to their extreme corruption.
And you would assume an omnipotent deity would just act unilaterally, just wipe them out.
But instead, the text portrays God treating Abraham like a strategic partner. The narrative introduces a fascinating pause. The divine essentially wonders aloud, should I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? It frames the impending destruction not as a top-down decree, but as a consultation.
Which kicks off an intense negotiation. Abraham pushes back against the divine plan. He asks, are you really going to sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you spare the whole city for 50?
And God agrees.
Yeah, and then Abraham haggles. He's like, what about 45? 30? 20? He eventually negotiates God down to sparing the entire city if just 10 righteous people can be found. But, okay, I have to push back here on behalf of anyone analyzing the underlying logic of this text.
Oh, right.
Wait, if God is omniscient and already knows exactly how many righteous people are in the city, why go through the theater of consulting a human? Like, why invite the negotiation at all?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source argues the negotiation has nothing to do with God needing data. The primary goal of the divine in these texts is the cultivation of a relationship and the forging of human character.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, notice the specific nature of Abraham's negotiation. He isn't utilizing this unprecedented access to the divine to ask for more land or better herds or personal longevity.
Right.
He is spending his relational capital to intercede for the lives of others, specifically the inhabitants of a deeply wicked city. The negotiation is a crucible that proves Abraham possesses the selfless character required for leadership.
Wow, okay, so he is leveraging his position entirely for the benefit of strangers. That is the exact same psychological profile as the man who turned down the king of Sodom's loot.
Precisely. And this dynamic introduces what the lecturer identifies as the contrast principle.
The contrast principle.
Yeah. The source points out a recurring mechanism throughout these ancient texts where divine victory is intentionally decoupled from obvious human strength.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that, because the contrast principle is a fascinating concept.
Well, consider the archetypal stories. David versus Goliath features a teenager with a leather sling against an armored veteran giant. Gideon is commanded to continually reduce his army until he has only 300 men left to face a massive invading force.
And Abraham has his 318 men against a coalition of nations.
Exactly. The lecturer posits that the starker the contrast between your lack of resources and the size of the obstacle, the clearer the divine presence becomes.
It makes perfect psychological sense, really. Human nature is wired to attribute success to the most obvious tangible asset. If you win a war with an overwhelming, technologically superior army, human ego naturally congratulates the generals in the supply chain.
Of course.
But if you win with a kid and a rock, or 318 guys with a lot of nerve, you starve the human ego of its ability to take credit. You are forced to recognize an external higher power.
And this principle demands something incredibly difficult from human beings. It demands the total surrender of their own leverage. You cannot experience the contrast principle if you refuse to let go of your conventional weapons and strategies.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source uses this concept of surrender to launch a sharp critique of modern religious and spiritual practices. The lecture observes that the selflessness of Abraham, his willingness to actively discard leverage, is the exact opposite of how faith is widely practiced today.
Right. The speaker adopts a broad anthropological view, arguing that modern faith across various global traditions has largely devolved into a transactional arrangement.
Transaction.
Yeah, the divine is frequently treated as a cosmic vending machine. A person inputs a prayer, an offering, or a ritual and expects wealth, health, or a promotion to drop into the tray.
It is treating a profound, life-altering relationship the exact same way you treat an ATM. You punch in your PIN code of good deeds and just expect cash to dispense. It completely neuters the concept of faith.
It really does.
And to illustrate that this is a universal human failing, the source brings in some incredibly specific anecdotes from other cultural traditions. The lecturer mentions a Buddhist professor who is deeply critical of modern practitioners.
Right, the Bulgong example.
Yes. This professor explained that the true historical concept of Bulgong, the Buddhist practice of making offerings, was never designed as a tool to beg the universe for personal blessings. The mechanism of Bulgong is entirely about the act of emptying oneself.
It's about letting go.
Exactly. Letting go of the ego, not acquiring more stuff. But people show up at the temple simply to ask for favorable outcomes.
And the source pairs that with an observation from a modern shaman, which I found fascinating. In ancient traditions, a shaman's role was highly sacrificial. They acted as the community's spiritual filter, basically absorbing and alleviating the psychic and physical pain of the people around them.
That sounds like a heavy, taxing burden.
It was, and this modern shaman expressed intense frustration because her clients no longer want that traditional engagement. They simply come to her to purchase good luck.
Unbelievable.
They want to buy a favorable outcome for their business or their personal lives, completely bypassing the self-sacrificial core of the practice.
They want the transaction without the transformation.
Yeah.
And the source connects this modern commodification of spirituality directly back to Abraham to show how far we've strayed.
Look at the trajectory of Abraham's life. He is instructed to leave his homeland and his entire support system, and he does it. He is offered unimaginable wealth from the spoils of war, and he turns it down. And in the ultimate, most agonizing test of this principle, he is asked to sacrifice his own son, Isaac.
Right. That is the narrative where Abraham takes Isaac up the mountain, fully prepared to follow through, and at the absolute last second, the divine intervenes. A ram is found caught in a thicket to take Isaac's place, and Abraham names the location Jehovah-Jireh, which translates to, the Lord will provide.
Through every phase of his life, Abraham demonstrates that true faith is about surrender, not extraction. It is not about manipulating the divine to get what you want. It is about discovering what you are capable of letting go of. The source challenges the listener to audit their own spiritual or personal growth motivations. Like, are you operating a transactional mindset, seeking that cosmic vending machine? Or are you engaging in the difficult, necessary process of letting go?
So Abraham represents what happens when you voluntarily surrender your leverage.
Yeah.
But what if you refuse? What if you are someone who obsessively hoards power, control, and advantage?
Then you get the Jacob story.
Exactly. The source shifts to the next generation, specifically Abraham's grandson, Jacob, to explore that exact opposite scenario. And the familial dynamics here are so messy, realistic, and instantly recognizable.
You have Isaac's twin sons, Esau and Jacob, who cannot be more different. Esau is the rugged, outgoing hunter. He thrives in the wilderness and is very explicitly his father's favorite. Jacob, on the other hand, is portrayed as a quiet, indoorsy figure who prefers staying among the tents and is deeply enmeshed with his mother, Rebecca.
And the source grounds these ancient patriarchs in incredibly practical human realities. At one point, discussing the logistical headache of the family needing to find a wife for Isaac from their distant ancestral homeland because they refuse to assimilate with the local Canaanites, the lecturer humorously compares it to modern rural bachelors.
That was a great analogy.
Yeah, it's like a farmer today seeking a bride from a completely different country because no one in the local urban centers wants to move out to the remote countryside. It strips away the mythic sheen and just presents them as a family dealing with practical, everyday friction.
But that friction turns toxic because Jacob refuses the path of surrender. Aided by his mother, Jacob executes a massive deception. He waits until his father Isaac is old and blind. Jacob dresses in his brother Esau's clothes, wrapped goat skins around his arms to mimic his brother's hairy forearms.
Which is wild to think about.
That is wild, and he tricks his father into granting him the family birthright and the primary blessing.
We have to elevate what birthright actually means here, because it's not just ancient identity theft. In an ancient nomadic society, the birthright meant assuming the social, economic, and spiritual leadership of the entire clan. It was the ultimate leverage.
He took everything.
Jacob didn't just steal money. He stole the future.
Yeah.
And the fallout is catastrophic. Esau vows to murder him. Jacob is forced to flee for his life, abandoning the wealth, the comfort, and the mother he just schemed so hard to secure.
He loses it all anyway.
She ends up completely alone in the wilderness. The text says he stops for the night at a place called Bethel. He is so utterly destitute that he uses a rock for a pillow. He is sleeping in the dirt. This is the definition of rock bottom. But, and this is the pivotal twist of the narrative, this exact moment of total deprivation is when the divine appears to him.
Jacob has a vision of a ladder reaching to heaven, and God promises him, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go.
It is a profound manifestation of divine presence. Hold on, I have to be the voice of the listener here. Jacob is a calculating scammer. He lied to his blind father's face. He usurped his brother's life. He is sleeping on a rock solely because of his own toxic ambition. Why in the world is he receiving a vision of angels and a divine promise of protection? Logically, he should be receiving a cosmic reprimand.
This raises an important question, and it strikes at the core mechanism of grace as interpreted by the source. Human logic dictates that Jacob's deception demands punishment. The divine logic in this narrative operates on a completely different axis.
How so?
Well, God does not appear in the dream with a ledger of Jacob's sins. There is no interrogation. God doesn't say, look at what your obsession with leverage has cost you.
There is no demand for an apology before the blessing.
None. The divine simply meets him in his absolute deepest crisis. The lecturer points out that the concept of Emmanuel, which means God with us, rarely manifests when humans are victorious or entirely self-sufficient.
It manifests when we have exhausted our own cleverness.
Exactly. Jacob spent his entire life relying on his cunning to orchestrate outcomes. That cunning bought him a rock in the wilderness. He is violently stripped of all his illusions of control.
His ego is finally starved. It is the contrast principle achieved through failure rather than voluntary surrender.
Exactly. The source draws a compelling parallel between Jacob at Bethel and the New Testament narrative of Jesus on the cross, forgiving the thief hanging beside him. In both instances, the divine connects with the human precisely at the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah.
Jacob is entirely out of options. He has zero leverage left to trade. It is the violent end of his transactional mindset. The source posits that true spiritual connection occurs in that specific emptiness, because there is finally nothing left of Jacob's ego blocking the path.
So what does this all mean? When we synthesize these narratives, the lecture presents two distinct trajectories for achieving profound transformation. You have the Abraham trajectory and you have the Jacob trajectory.
What makes this source's conclusion so fascinating is how it frames that transformation. It suggests you can voluntarily let go of your need for control, like Abraham actively refusing the king's wealth and relying on the contrast principle. Or you can cling to your leverage until life violently strips it away, leaving you, like Jacob, terrified and sleeping on a stone.
Either you voluntarily walk away from the transaction or the vending machine breaks down entirely. But the analytical takeaway from the source material is that both trajectories end at the exact same breakthrough.
They do.
That moment of absolute emptiness, whether chosen or enforced, is the mandatory truth for transformation. It is where the human ego dies, making space for something vastly more resilient to take root.
It fundamentally redefines our concepts of strength and vulnerability. The text argues that our moments of total lack are not the end of the narrative, but rather the essential atmospheric conditions required for a new beginning.
Which brings us to a final thought I want you to carry with you. We spent this deep dive analyzing ancient patriarchs, military logistics, and the psychology of leverage. But apply this directly to your own landscape. Think about a current friction point in your life right now. A situation where you feel completely outmatched, where your resources are depleted, and where you have absolutely zero leverage.
It's a scary place to be.
It is. Human instinct screams at us to scramble for control in those moments. But what if, applying the ancient contrast principle we unpacked today, your absolute lack of leverage right now isn't an indicator of failure? What if your inability to control the outcome is actually the exact structural prerequisite for your greatest breakthrough? What if the rock you are sleeping on is the foundation for something incredible? Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep seeking out the knowledge that challenges your assumptions, and we will catch you next time.